At the beginning of the 1970s, a band emerged from Los Angeles. It was a band so eclectic and unusual in style and sound that almost no one could say where it had come from. It was a band that instantly captured the admiration of rock stars, producers, music writers. A band that radio DJs rushed to play. It was a band that struggled to sell any records, that seldom troubled the charts, that was rarely seen on television, that was never called to award ceremonies. But it was a band that was loved with uncommon fervor by all that heard its music. The band was called Little Feat.
Yeah, they were an incredible live band, but that other thing that they were putting across while they were being a great live band is what made people just go absolutely gaga over them. And gaga is not a bad word for the feeling that Little Feat was able to generate while Lowell was alive.
At the center of the Little Feat story is Lowell George, the group's frontman and principal songwriter. Over the course of a decade leading the Feats, George wove a unique tapestry, a singular artistic vision that ended tragically with his untimely death in '79, but that left an indelible mark on the history of rock and roll.
Anyone who saw Little Feat or loved Little Feat or knew Lowell George remembers him with enormous affection and loves what he stood for, which was something really individual, really different, very sensual, funky, poetic, surreal, and funny.
He was the guy you wanted to hang out with, you know. He was someone I looked up to. The concentration, the focusing, the intensity with which he approached his music was a real example.
Lowell was the hyperbole of anarchy and rebellion. He was an iconoclast. Somehow or another, I don't get the idea that Lowell would have accepted a Grammy. I think that he was beyond that.
He felt strongly that he knew what music was sincere and credible and artful. He thought that music could change the world, thought that he could make a song that would change people's minds.
Los Angeles, 1965, and the rebirth of American rock and roll is underway. Fired by the arrival of the Beatles and the accompanying wave of British bands that had overwhelmed the music scene a year earlier, local musicians had deserted the folk clubs and coffee houses of the early 60s and traded in their acoustic guitars for amplifiers and drum kits. A new youth culture emerged. Its locus, LA's Sunset Strip. Its leaders, the Byrds. It was the era of folk rock, and music's center of gravity shifted from the gray skyscrapers of New York to the glittering beaches of California.
It was very vibrant. Sunset Strip had a number of clubs that were very teen-oriented. A few of them they didn't serve alcohol. You know, you could get underage kids to go in, a place called Pandora's Box, which I had a band that played there, and another club called It's Boss.
The kids were up and down the street by the thousands. There was nothing like it before or since. I mean, it was the most magical time ever.
There was this huge opportunity to find talent to somehow, hey, we got to move units, we got to sell because there's opportunity. So a lot of bands got signed and a lot of stuff was happening very quickly. Byrds being obviously the biggest example, but a lot of smaller bands were part of this local scene here. For that brief period of time, from mid-60s to mid-70s, it was the reason why everybody came here. It was the reason why people from all over the world figured if they got to LA, they'd have a shot at musical stardom. The few that survived, that got through, that became these names that we know all these years later, were just the very tip of the iceberg. There were hundreds of bands, and the Factory was one of them.
In amongst the throng of folk rock aggregations, ersatz beat groups, blues bands and harmony singers, Lowell George, frontman of an obscure local group called The Factory, was trying to make a name.
He was quintessentially Californian. The Georges had a great ranch. They spent some time in Nevada. They were part of the early pioneer families that pushed west and created the frontier and expanded it, went beyond it, moved it, and Lowell was like that. So it's fair to say that although I didn't know him at the time, Lowell was equally influenced by this new sense of self that the Byrds gave every aspiring California musician.